Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sofia Strid, the scientific coordinator of UniSAFE. I'd like to start by saying thank you to everyone who has contributed and made today possible, to the speakers, the participants, the organizers, the University of Namur, and not least to the UniSAFE RPO community and to the UniSAFE partner teams who have been working relentlessly and excellently over the past 3 years to make today possible. I say the last 3 years, but the UniSAFE collaboration started slightly earlier than that, and as did our own work on gender-based violence in other projects and other constellations. For me, the UniSAFE journey started 4.5 years ago at the European Conference on Politics and Gender in Amsterdam, when Anne-Laure Humbert had an idea. And she showed me the European Commission work program and the call for proposals on gender-based violence and sexual harassment in European research organizations and universities. And over the course of the conference, we managed to develop a very rough draft first outline of the project, and we had identified and approached some of the partners who, or some people who later became partners, who were actually present at the very same conference. The specific challenge outlined by the call made clear that gender-based violence was prevalent across research organizations in Europe, although no one knew exactly how prevalent. Numerous reports had shown the detrimental effects on women and men who had been subjected to sexual harassment, detrimental effects both on their personal well-being but also on their scientific careers, although no one knew how to address this or how it differed for different groups and with what consequences. Several studies had also shown that women in precarious conditions, for example PhD candidates and internationally mobile researchers, were particularly at risk of being subjected to gender-based violence, although again no one knew exactly what the risks looked like and with what consequences. The challenge, as set out by the scope of the call, was to investigate the various forms of gender-based violence for both staff and students, including the situation of those with short-term affiliation, as well as looking at potential additional social determinants, for example ethnicity and sexual orientation. It was to identify the role of universities and research organizations, including research funding organizations and support networks, in preventing gender-based violence, protecting victims, and prosecuting perpetrators. It was to develop evidence-based case studies of implemented measures at organizational level for the prevention, protection, and prosecution, and to outline what worked and what did not work in various contexts. It was to formulate concrete recommendations for universities, research organizations, and research funding organizations on how to combat gender-based violence. And finally, the challenge was to disseminate the outcomes and the materials and to carry out information and training sessions for decision makers, staff, and students. And all this was to be done by taking the national legal and policy frameworks into account and, where needed, collect quantitative and qualitative data from at least 15 member states or associated countries. The expected impacts to reach were 4. It was a better understanding of gender-based violence in European universities and research organizations. It was effective policies and measures to address gender-based violence in universities and research organizations. It was the increased capacity of staff and students to address gender-based violence, and it was the overall reduction of gender-based violence in academic environment and work and study places in Europe. Now, UniSAFE, which was the only project funded under this call, has spent the last 3 years achieving this and more. So in the following, I will try and show how, by introducing our conceptual framework, while situating it in some current tensions and debates. Our key approach has been to frame the overall UniSAFE project as a multi-level feminist and intersectional project based on a holistic 7P model, including prevalence, prevention, protection, prosecution, partnership, provision of services, and policy. And it's been designed to make a real, tangible impact. By multi-level, I mean that we have collected and analyzed data and their interrelation and produced tools and recommendations at the micro, meso, and macro level, at the individual, institutional, and national levels. Theoretically, the UniSAFE conceptual framework is framed by gender theory, feminist violence studies, and intersectionality. And these have been applied in both the collection and analysis of data and in their translations to insights, tools, and recommendations. And this approach, in turn, has required us to approach gender-based violence in institutions from an organizational violence perspective, rather than approaching it from an individualist perspective. And this might sound straightforward, but it is not. First, there are different understandings and ways of conceptualizing gender in different national and organizational contexts and between different academic disciplines and scholars. And this poses a challenge to any European project working on gender issues, not just UniSAFE. Excuse me. To some, gender is something that is. It's a variable, accountable form of data. And to others, gender is something that does, something that stratifies, unequalizes, and differentiates between people, where behaviors, expressions, and identities of women, men, and further genders are socially constructed, or gender is a doing, a process inscribed in daily practices and learned and understood through norms, institutions, and structures of femininities and masculinities and power. In addition to these disciplinary, organizational, and national and political disagreements on the concept of gender, throughout the project duration, we've been witnessing an increased and open hostility and the far right and right-wing anti-gender movement that entirely opposes what it refers to as gender ideology or gender theory, rejecting the most basic notion that the sex binary does not capture the complexity of the human species. So we are working in a time where members of the anti-gender movement oppose gender equality, gender policies, gender mainstreaming, and gender studies as an academic discipline, and not least LGBTQ+ rights. And here, I believe that UniSAFE is making a significant contribution by establishing that gender identity and LGBT status significantly increases the risk of being subjected to violence in European universities and research organizations. Second, there are different understandings, definitions, and measurements of gender-based violence in different national and organizational contexts and between different academic disciplines and scholars. Where some argue that violence should be interpreted narrowly and measured as individual acts of injury, and often with a physical component, meaning that, for example, sexual harassment or gender harassment, economic violence, or psychological violence does not count as violence. UniSAFE has argued and shown that violence is systemic and part of a wider system, including the academic, of dominance, privilege, and power. And in this wider system, gender-based violence is not only a violation of human rights, it's a simultaneous cause and consequence of gendered inequalities and an inequality in its own right. Further, violence generates violence, and multiple forms of gender-based violences are interrelated, connected, and co-constitute a system of violence. Violence as a system underlines that violence is more than individual incidents and experiences, and this means dismissing the narrative that describes gender-based violence as isolated, individual, or deviant incidents. And in this system, the relatively less powerful women, marginalized groups, and minorities are the expected victims of violence, and the relatively powerful and privileged are the expected perpetrators, or beneficiaries of violence. And all of us are bystanders, people who see or hear or know of violence. Understanding violence as a system means that gender-based violence cannot be explained nor addressed without considering how seemingly individual experiences are interconnected, intersectional, and relate to the wider academic and societal contexts. And this calls for a multi-level approach where victims' experiences of violence become meaningful as a starting point for further analysis, not as an end point. And this is why we have used the UniSAFE survey results to analyze the experiences of violence in the context of institutional and national policy and measures, and produced a multi-level intersectional analysis which includes the micro, the meso, and the macro. And this brings us to a third conceptual challenge, intersectionality. While arguing for the importance of intersectionality and applying it in our analysis, there are multiple tensions and different understandings of inequalities, how they intersect, and of what inequalities, if any, that are more important than others, and when, and how, and why. Intersectionality can be understood as the interconnected and complex ways in which multiple identities and inequalities, such as age, gender, and sexuality, are shaped by different axes of power among different sets of social relations, and how these interact and position people differently. Our intersectional approach has allowed us to consider the experiences of gender-based violence by different groups, women, men, and non-binary people, according to factors that might create disadvantage and increase consequences, such as, for example, form of employment and the time spent in the institution. So we have used both intersectional and contextual approaches in multi-level modeling, as they allow for interactions between national and institutional variables and individual ones, which can help explain how institutions and actors relate to each other, how inequalities might operate in different ways across countries, and it has also allowed us for the integration of a broader range of factors, which previously have tended to skew the results towards the individual level, as opposed to the institutional or the societal levels. And here, I think we can say that UniSAFE's multi-level intersectional analysis, which includes the micro and the meso and the macro, has contributed to the growing body of literature which explores how to transpose intersectional frameworks into a more advanced quantitative methodology. So overall, our conceptual framework has forced us to tackle some tensions and conflicts emanating from different strands of epistemology, ontology, and social and political contexts. Conflicts that we may not have solved them, but where UniSAFE at least has provided potential routes to disentangling them, and we have pushed the current state of the art and the field forward, both theoretically and methodologically. Regarding the empirical state of the art, let's return to the other key component of our conceptual framework, the 7 Ps. UniSAFE has moved beyond the required 3 Ps of prevention, protection, and prosecution of the call, and collected and analyzed data, policies, and measures, and produced tools and recommendations on prevalence, prevention, protection, prosecution, provision of services, partnerships, and policies. And we've done this for students, teachers, research organizations, research funding organizations, umbrella organizations, and for policymakers at the institutional, national, and European levels. On the micro level, we have conducted the largest cross-cultural survey in Europe of its kind on the prevalence, consequences, social determinants, and the contextual factors along the remaining 6 Ps, in addition to prevalence, of gender-based violence. And the analysis of the more than 42,000 respondents from 46 research performing organizations in 15 countries shows that gender-based violence is a widespread systemic problem in European higher education and research. And while the overall prevalence is shockingly high, it is unequal across different groups of respondents, where it's slightly higher for women, LGBTQ people, and ethnic minorities, and much higher for non-binary people and for those with a disability or a chronic illness. This also shows that gender-based violence in academia is normalized. Victims do not report violence, partly because they do not think that it is serious enough to report, and partly because they did not recognize the act of violence as violence. Digging beyond the numbers, the UniSAFE individual in-depth interviews with nearly 60 researchers show a very similar pattern of violence as a system. Experiences of gender-based violence in research organizations are generally not isolated, single or accidental cases. Incidents are frequently repeated, they cover multiple forms of violence, and they last for months and sometimes even years. At the meso level, we have analyzed organizational responses and infrastructures through a strategic mapping of gender-based violence policies in 48 universities and research organizations from the UniSAFE 15-country sample, and we have created an inventory of measures to address it. This analysis shows that none of the mapped institutions have sufficient policy frameworks to address prevalence, prevent violence, protect victims, prosecute perpetrators, engage in partnerships with relevant stakeholders, or to provide sufficient services to victims. Also at the meso level, we have analyzed institutional responses via 16 in-depth case studies in the UniSAFE 15-country sample, including some 100 interviews and 25 focus groups with a total of nearly 200 participants, showing that the implementation of institutional measures largely depends on voluntary work sustained by key actors' personal beliefs in gender equality and activism. It also shows that institutional responses often fail at the implementation stage due to insufficient leadership support, insufficient resources, and individual and institutional resistances. At the macro level, we have set the European policy baseline of policies in place to address gender-based violence by mapping and analyzing legal and policy frameworks on gender-based violence and gender-based violence in higher education and research in 33 countries, showing that there are insufficient policies on gender-based violence, showing that at the time of the analysis, research funding organizations in the EU did not have policies in place to address gender-based violence. And this baseline sets out a fixed point of reference for future comparisons. Now, UniSAFE have taken the empirical results from the micro, the meso, and the macro levels and combined it with the results of a series of European workshops with representatives from universities and research organizations to build a publicly available toolbox, a toolkit to reduce gender-based violence. And this toolkit includes recommendations for research performing organizations, research funding organizations, policymakers, higher education and research institution associations, umbrella organizations, staff associations and staff unions, student associations and student unions. And we have provided tools such as guidelines for developing a protocol for addressing gender-based violence in research and higher education institutions, serving as a comprehensive guide for those who want to develop such protocol. We have provided an assessment framework for research organizations to take stock on where they are and where they need to focus their attention. We have provided step-by-step guides, one on setting up a comprehensive policy framework addressing gender-based violence in academia, and one on awareness-raising campaigns on gender-based violence with inspiring practices, one from Namur. So to try and sum up, In responding to the European Commission's 2019 call on gender-based violence, including sexual harassment, in research organizations and universities, UniSAFE has shown that despite the extensive legislation and policy to eradicate gender-based violence and to protect victims, gender-based violence persists and has become a near normalized part of academic cultures across the European research area. To address this, UniSAFE has provided a better understanding on the prevalence, prevention, protection, prosecution, partnerships, provision of services and policies from an intersectional perspective in European research organizations and universities. And we have used this better understanding and knowledge to build an evidence-based toolkit to reduce gender-based violence in education and research work and study places in Europe. And to conclude, the good news is that we now have the knowledge and we have the tools to reduce gender-based violence and its consequences in research organizations. But the challenge is now for the commitment of a responsible academic and political leadership to provide sufficient, dedicated and sustainable resources to use this knowledge and to use these tools so that we can make universities and research organizations safe from gender-based violence in Europe. Thank you very much for listening, and best of luck with the rest of the conference.